Hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Harrison. I'm the founder and lead instructor at the School of Applied Functional Medicine, SAFM. The topic of the day is functional interconnectedness, which of course we talk a lot about, but today I want to dive deeply into what are the patterns or the aspects of interconnectedness that even progressive savvy practitioners are most often missing. And this is not speculation. We have the deep pleasure of educating thousands of healthcare practitioners. We see what are some of the patterns that we're most likely to overlook or to simply set aside, maybe not give quite the credence or the weight that they really deserve when you're looking at the body through the lens of functional medicine interconnectedness. And to define a few terms here that might be helpful for some of you who are relatively new to the concept, we talk about this notion of interconnectedness, which transcends a lot of the separating silos of designation or consideration through traditional medical specialties. The difference between the digestive system, right, or the urogenitoury system, or the respiratory system, which may be a very important focus and delineation when it comes to surgical expertise and actually looking at anatomical disease. Which is very appropriate for acute and emergency medicine and intervention. But the vast majority of people that are looking for support today are actually wrestling on a much higher volume level with chronic disease, in particular chronic lifestyle-mediated inflammatory disease. And of course, something that's inflammation promoting that's happening in our gut or in our liver or in our brain or in our left big toe. It's not separated from the rest of the body. Artificial separations keep us from appropriately casting a broader net and considering how might what is happening in my mouth be affecting my left knee? How what is happening in my large intestines might it actually be affecting my brain health or my moods? Everything is interconnected through the functional medicine lens. And when we talk about a chain of interconnectedness, it's really about studying the common chains of causality, the common patterns of causality between upstream root causes and mediators of imbalance or blockage or impairment, and how they progressively precipitate through a logical scientific chain of causality in terms of creating downstream symptoms. Now, disease dynamics, debilitating physiological dynamics, things that eventually cause enough suffering to be severe enough to be diagnosable. And of course, so much of our purpose, our drive in the world of functional medicine is about trying to intervene as soon as possible when those patterns are not ragingly severe, but when they're just beginning to brew, where they may simply be showing up symptomatically. They're not making marked perturbations yet in lab work, for example, or they're not so highly debilitating to the unique patient yet that they are deeply suffering and really having to miss work or having a huge impairment on some of their primary relationships or activities. We want to engage earlier when you might say there's dis-ease in functional systems in the body rather than a diagnosable disease that's much more severe and intracted. It doesn't mean that it can't still be reversed and shifted. It's just more challenging when we respond late. And so today I want to talk about some of the patterns that are often missed in pursuit of helping all of us collectively to learn from one another and to respond sooner, to respond more proactively, more keenly, with more proactive discernment in order to help people to restore functional balance so that what they're suffering with never ideally becomes severe enough to be diagnosable. And let me say as I get started here, if you know that this is a topic that's going to be of interest to people in your social media community, let me invite you to share this broadcast. It's going to be loaded with clinical pearls, and I would love for you to share the wealth of that with others in your communities. But I want to start off by talking about what is perhaps the most common nutrient that's absolutely essential for so many different biochemical processes. In fact, just living requires this nutrient, and it's the one that we tend to not focus on very much. I think if you were to ask a lot of practitioners what nutrient do they focus on, depending on their specialty, they may talk about how magnesium insufficiency is widespread, and as we age, inadequate vitamin B12 is critical and contributes to so much memory loss and anxiety and unsteady gait, right? Others might talk about muscle wasting and the classic sarcopenia of age and this type of thing. But those are all valid and appropriate concepts. But I want to talk about oxygen. And our need to start thinking about oxygen as a nutrient. It is an element. It is a critical cofactor in the foundational aspects of human survival and vitality. We talk about mitochondrial health. We talk about ATP synthesis, and we argue about carbs versus fats. We talk about coenzyme Q10 and vitamin E and vitamin B6 and all of these essential nutrients and glutathione sufficiency to protect mitochondria. Yes, 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 yes. But none of it happens well if we don't have optimal steady state oxygenation of our bodies. And we tend to take breathing for granted. You know, if you're standing and you're conscious, you must be breathing optimally. Well, not so much. I believe that snoring is probably the most overlooked symptom, the most undervalued symptom. Most of our patients and clients think about snoring as being an annoyance, whether it's something we do or something our partner is doing. But snoring is oxygen deprivation overnight during a time when by and large, our body is looking to be healing and actually restoring tissues and various biochemical enzymes and whatnot overnight in order to prepare us for another day. But snoring is oxygen deprivation. It also involves breathing through the mouth, which dries mucous membranes and impairs the action of things like secretory IgA and other immune cells in the mouth, which help to keep good dental health and keep us from having infectious dynamics in the mouth. So snoring needs to be a part of every single one of our assessments. It's not just an annoyance. It's a major contributor to disease. And perhaps even worse than that, sleep apnea, I think, is the most underexplored disease dynamic. Again, people may think of sleep apnea as just being an annoyance. You know, my sleep is interrupted. I sleep lightly. I don't sleep deeply. Depending on how deeply your partner sleeps, they may or may not actually be aware of the number of times we, to some degree, gasp for air in the middle of the night. But this is way more than an annoyance. From our nervous system's viewpoint, realistically, we almost died many times overnight, and we had to get a pop of adrenaline in order to restore oxygenation. But through the continued cycling of that sympathetic driven gasping for air, we are flooding the body with stress hormones, and it contributes to priming a more elevated cortisol awakening response the next day. And completely separate from food, these type of insidious physiological stress dynamics, right? People could have no mental emotional stress. They feel spiritually grounded, relationship grounded. They think they have no stress. But physiological stress is just as potent, if not more so, in triggering our primed hypervigilant stress response that puts us in more of a sympathetic dominant nervous system mode. And this all on its own increases blood sugar and can set off the cascade of metabolic dysfunction completely separate from the diet. Maybe people have a low glycemic diet, an ideal diet for their unique metabolism. But we need to remember that stress is a metabolic modulator on purpose, because if you're trying to survive, you need good, potent blood sugar. If you need to run for your life, fight, flight, hide, right? Of course you need high blood sugar. You need hypervigilance. You need to not sleep very deeply. You need high blood pressure, right? You need to be able to respond aggressively to the current circumstances physically in order to survive. But when we're doing this on a regular basis for reasons we don't acknowledge, much less do something about, this alone is disease promoting. And so I want to encourage all of us to think keenly about oxygenation. Where are people snoring and they're not overtly dealing with it? Where do people have sleep apnea that hasn't been diagnosed or assessed? Where are people mouth breathing, which again is not only a sign that people likely have significant nasal respiratory congestion, and so especially when they're unconscious at night, they are defaulting into breathing out of their mouth because of that congestion. They wake up feeling not very rested, but also feeling very dry throat, dry mouth. They've got more of that sort of mucosal buildup in their throat, which is part of why they want to have a good strong cup of tea or coffee to be able to clear all of that. These are people who are more likely to struggle from infectious dynamics in the mouth, right? Maybe they have a history of root canals. Maybe they have more extractions, more dental caries, right? Bad breath, these kinds of things because of microbial imbalances in the mouth. So we need to think about oxygen being a critical nutrient. And actually, I think our patterns of breath not only can set up a sympathetic nervous system dynamic, but part of how we can begin to entrain our nervous system and set a new precedent for a more balanced stress response is actually through our breathing and through mindful breathing. I think one of the easiest, most accessible mindfulness habits that anyone can engage with is scheduling. You can use an alarm, a schedule on your cell phone to simply create 1, 2, 3, 5 opportunities during the day to set a schedule for 5 minutes of mindful breathing, where we simply sit quietly, close our eyes, focus on our breath, and begin to take long, slow, deep inhalations through the nose, and then slow, complete exhalations, where the exhalation is even longer than the inhalation. And again, it's through the nose. People can feel, it's been well demonstrated that this does calm the nervous system. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system and enhances vagal transmission, which is good for the vast majority of what ails the people we're serving in our practices. But mindful breathing is free. It can be done pretty much anywhere. It doesn't have to be done in big, giant chunks of time. No memberships required, right? When we're thinking about helping people to relax, one of the biggest practitioner missteps is going right away to something hard, something really challenging. Oh, you need to relax, you should meditate. Whoa, that's like telling someone who eats fast food 3 times a day that they should stay home and make wild salmon and organic broccoli for dinner tomorrow. It's not going to happen. It's too much too fast. We have to customize our pace for what people need in order to make baby steps and adopt sustainable lifestyle changes. And having simple, accessible, easy to succeed at ideas in your creative toolbox is really key for helping people to make progress, but also galvanizing their belief in you as a practitioner. Because if everything you recommend is just too darn hard, they may give you a lot of credibility, but they're going to walk away from you and your practice and from the possibility of an amazing long-term relationship with you as a practitioner simply because it feels too hard for them, right? It's not the right time. I'm sure it's great, but it's not for me. That's code language from a patient of, I need more creativity. I need you to slow down. I need more options. I need more tools. And so mindful breathing is a great way to help people to actually calm their nervous system mode. You know, so often what people are wrestling with, whether it's IBS type symptoms or trouble going to sleep, or infertility, or impaired detoxification, or maldigestion, malabsorption of nutrients. There are so many functional balances that are naturally deprioritized in a body that is in primarily a sympathetic nervous system mode. Now, if the body is promoting survival, it emphasizes a completely different set of muscle contractions and neural transmissions and glandular secretions, hormone balances through the HPA-TG axis. And rather than trying to manipulate the body and sort of fix it, it's so much more straightforward, and it's the only thing that's sustainable, is actually changing the root causes that the body is responding to. Even in the functional medicine world, there's still too much of a focus on, all right, I see this is out of balance. Let me force it to be different. But the body has a really logical reason why it's being imbalanced. And if we change the environment of the life, the body will shift. And sure, sometimes we need to work on interventions that will help to support that. There may be missing nutrients. There may be a need to address a blockage, whether that's a insufficient antioxidant or some kind of infectious dynamic. But we want to allow the unique body to, with ease, sustain a high vitality state. And anytime you're forcing the body to do something, ease is not going to be part of the equation, my friends. And also disease recurrence is almost inevitable. The body doesn't promote chronic dis-ease and strong symptoms because it's broken or disconnected from reality or against us or any of those things that our patients believe. Is because it's having a logical response to the environment in which we're asking it to live. And so breathing is something we need to pay attention to. When you do an intake session, is that person a mouth breather? Do they have shallow breathing? Can you see their chest and their shoulders expanding? Do they seem relaxed and comfortable? Are their ears up here? What are they showing you? Do they breathe through their nose? Do they breathe through their mouth? Do they seem to exhale at all? These are things we can pay attention to in terms of a focus. The other thing, I want to shift gears here, but while we're on the topic of nervous system mode and taking a look at what is affecting people, I want to talk about metabolic disease because, as I said, functional medicine attracts some complex cases. Often patients who've been to not just one, but 2, 3, 5, 10 other practitioners, and they still haven't found relief. And we know that so often when people are struggling with various states of metabolic disease, that part of the challenge can be their diet. Of course it is. It's got too many refined carbohydrates in it, too many chemicals, too many sugars. But sometimes the diet is not the primary problem. In fact, sometimes the diet seems pretty darn optimal and a person's working really hard to keep it that way. But stress, all on its own, is a mediator of metabolic disease. And I want to encourage you to start to think about this rather than judging someone's metabolic health on the surface just based on diet, or for that matter, just based on their blood sugar data. I think one of the largest missed opportunities in preventing chronic disease that we have in our practices today is the chance to look further upstream, assess and find metabolic dysfunction before it ever has anything to do with elevated blood sugar. At SCFM, we teach that there's 4 stages of metabolic dysfunction. And if we wait for fasting glucose to be really high or for hemoglobin A1C to be clinically high or even subclinically high, we're waiting to at least the middle of stage 3. What about stage 2? What about stage 1? How about stage 0? So often you can go back and look at lab work where people's practitioners have literally been waiting for hemoglobin A1C to finally become bad enough. We've been watching it year over year, trending outside the normal range in order to finally call it and say, hey, guess what? You have prediabetes and now you should do something about it. I think this is a huge disservice. If we look upstream at what goes awry before blood sugar ever goes elevated, we would start looking, I think, at every annual physical at fasting C-peptide, or at a minimum looking at fasting insulin. Where do we see more of a accelerated reaction from the pancreas, right? Endocrine function from the pancreas, higher and higher levels of insulin, in an anticipatory way, accommodating the higher glycemic load of our life. And yes, that includes stress, that includes inflammation, that includes diet. But where can we start to see fasting insulin or fasting C-peptide trend upward, even subclinically into the upper half of the normal range as an indication of a metabolic imbalance at play that we can engage now in order to reverse before it creates blood sugar problems, before it creates maybe fatty liver, before it creates increased adiposity or visceral adipose fat and obesity. We want to engage early on because there's an adaptive window where the pancreas is simply responding proactively, appropriately to the progressively higher glycemic load of our lives. And it's a travesty to me that we aren't catching that, given the widespread availability of fasting C-peptide or fasting insulin markers. Fasting C-peptide, I think, is a more reliable marker because C-peptide has a longer half-life in the body, so it's a more stable marker. But at a minimum, looking at fasting insulin and looking at subclinical elevation. And because in the classical pattern of metabolic disease progression, hyperinsulinemia is one of the first sort of official diagnostic thresholds, although we don't tend to catch it and address it unless it has other associated downstream effects like PCOS and infertility, these types of things. But if we're measuring it, we can catch it. And when there's hyperinsulinemia, people will start to experience episodic hypoglycemia, not hyperglycemia. When the first perturbation in blood sugar that you're most likely to see is actually going to be a hemoglobin A1C that is illogically low. Now you look at someone's diet, they're eating the standard American diet, a whole bunch of crap food, way too many refined carbohydrates, and their hemoglobin A1C is 5.0 or 4.8. We should not gloss over that. Do not give them a smiley face on their lab sheet, right? Fantastic. We should not ever assume that optimal valued markers necessarily allude to optimal functional balances in the body. Sometimes it's just an interim stage of dysfunction that's transiently optimal, that actually is belying an underlying disease dynamic. Make sure that the hemoglobin A1C results that you see in labs are logical given what you know about their diet. Someone who is eating a good, healthy, rich, appropriate carbohydrate diet, maybe a lower glycemic carbohydrate diet that's got the right amount given their activity. Sure, it can be awesome to see an A1C of 5.0. It makes sense. More of a ketogenic type of diet, maybe lower. It's representative of their diet. But if someone's eating a standard American diet, in no way should their A1C be 4.8. Naturally, and a reflection of strong functional balance. Behind the scenes, that average fasting glucose marker, right? Hemoglobin A1C, it should be reflecting a higher level of glycosylated hemoglobin. And if it's not, it's likely evidence of a hyperinsulinemia dynamic underneath, driving blood sugar lower than the diet would otherwise typically promote from a balance perspective. And so we want to be looking for low blood sugar, first of all. And keep in mind that hemoglobin A1C is a really valuable marker, right? No marker's perfect. Every marker has pros and cons and limitations and misinterpretations. A1C taken in tandem with a fasting C-peptide in tandem with a fasting glucose and a lipid panel can be excellent for assessing what's happening metabolically. And I'm really passionate at SAFM about teaching how to get the maximum amount of value out of everyday annual physical lab markers so that we're not feeling beholden to functional labs that are really expensive and not accessible to everyone. It's something I'm really passionate about. We order way too many functional labs as a community of practitioners before we're wringing the very last value out of what is already available, what is free, covered by insurance, covered by managed care. But we want to be looking for a hypoglycemic dynamic first. And only usually when a metabolic imbalance has been at play for 7, 10, 13, 15, 20 years, do we start to see it actually show up as marked hemoglobin A1C elevations. My friends, it's too late. I like to say it's like waiting for, the second story of your house to be on fire before you think about getting a smoke detector. We want to respond earlier and proactively in terms of getting in front of that. And I want to bounce from that to talking about the notion of insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is rampant. And of course, we want to be looking for these metabolic imbalances early on. But I want us to start thinking more often about what are the root causes and in terms of exacerbating factors for some of these disease dynamics. And I believe that in every case of insulin resistance, we should be looking for hypothyroid function. And in every case of hypothyroid function, we should be looking for insulin resistance, because these two are so often synergistic. And of course they are. They have both have a huge influence on mitochondrial function and ATP generation within the cells of our body. We need good intracellular thyroid function in order to promote insulin sensitivity. But at the same time, we need the brain, right? The hypothalamus and the pituitary. We need the thyroid gland itself. We need these tissues to have good insulin sensitivity so they can do their job, right? So that the hypothalamic pituitary axis can appropriately stimulate the body's hormone synthesis. In particular, the synthesis of thyroid hormone, especially T4. So that we have optimal responsiveness across our hormonal axis. And I really think that intracellular hypothyroid function is the most underdiagnosed dynamic in women. I think stress-mediated metabolic dysfunction is the most underdiagnosed dynamic in men. And both of them increase LDL. Both of them increase the release of free fatty acids. They cause redistribution of fat from adipose tissue into visceral ectopic fat, and promote fatty liver. And so in terms of really drilling down and looking at what is happening, we know that we like to say in shorthand, sluggish thyroid, sluggish anything. And it's so true. Hypothyroid function is something that it's an intracellular dynamic, and people can have that even when blood levels of thyroid hormones look perfect, which is a good reminder that lab work is only ever one puzzle piece. Please will help us stop treating people just based on labs. We have to consider the whole picture. We're both going to over and underdiagnose a huge host of disease dynamics by leading with the labs. In fact, we teach start with the rest of the picture. Start with the history, the diet, the symptom list. And then after you've pulled out all the puzzle pieces and mapped them and have a good sense of what's going on, then go to the labs at the end and see what's corroborated, see what new information pops out. So it helps us to see the person rather than filtering the person's idiosyncrasies through the lens of lab data. A huge amount is missed in that context. But I really think full thyroid panels. Just the other day, we did a webinar. We were talking about working through some case examples of thyroid lab data and just how much can be missed for decades. If you only look at TSH, if you only look at TSH and total T4, if you only look at TSH and free T4, I think we have a huge issue still with way too many women being undertreated for rich, entrenched hypothyroid function with T4 only medication. And in some cases, it's overprescribed T4, because if that's the primary tool you believe you have and people are still suffering, just giving more of it seems logical, but it's not a helpful response at that point. If you give too much T4 thyroid medication, you're actually going to trigger the body to have an override response, a skewing of the deiodinase enzymes that are used intracellularly to balance T4, T3, T2, and how much of it is active versus inactive. And when there's excessive intake of T4 medication or synthesis, like in a hyperthyroid dynamic, but if you're just taking too much T4, that actually will promote deactivation of T3 inside the cells. So not only is it not helping, it's actually hurting. If someone comes to you, they're taking levothyroxine, the dose isn't working, they still have a lot of hypothyroid symptoms, but if you increase T4, they seem to pick up a whole different set of symptoms. And so you're trying to find that sweet spot. It's probably T4 to T3 conversion. But if you just give more T4, they're going to go out of the frying pan into the fire, because the D3 deiodinase is not only converting T4 to reverse T3, it's deactivating T3 into an inactive form of T2. It's not only not helping, it's actually hurting. It's doing harm from a thyroid balance perspective. So we want to be cautious about the right solution for a given individual. Some people thrive on a T4 only medication. Not everybody needs an alternative, but there are a lot of people in our practices who are not thriving on T4 only medication. They would do much better with a balance of T4 and T3, whether it's separate scripts, a compound, or a natural thyroid extract, because the imbalances that are at play in their body are not just about the thyroid itself making T4. That may be at play, but often that's not the only thing that's at play. And because thyroid function affects the function of every cell in the body, often people need support for thyroid function to get out of the ditch that they're in order to get the liver working optimally again, get insulin sensitivity to work optimally again, get the pancreas to work optimally, get the brain to work optimally, get the immune system in the gut lining to work optimally again, so that functional imbalance can actually be restored. And so please be looking for functional hypothyroid imbalance and remembering that it's intracellular, and always assess symptoms comprehensively, because just because their lab work is perfect does not mean that intracellular dynamics behind the scenes are perfect. And I really want all of us to learn how to confidently and capably assess that. But I'm going to talk about some often missed dynamics. One of them has to do with histamine. Histamine, crazy powerful substance. We often think of it as an annoyance, right? When people have too much histamine or they're histamine intolerant, they may struggle with higher, more symptomatic experiences with allergy or asthma. They may have nasal-respiratory eustachian congestion that affects some symptoms sort of in the neck and up. But when we think about how does the body handle histamine, and oh, by the way, histamine is not something you want to block on an ongoing basis. So much goes awry with chronic use of antihistamine drugs. Now, we need histamine. It does a lot of critical, necessary biochemical functions in the body. But whether we're bringing histamine in from our foods or we're dealing with the histamine that is naturally produced by our microbiome, or in the gut, or the histamine that's produced by our immune cells throughout the body, maybe in response to an infectious dynamic or a toxin or, parasite, right? Who knows what kind of foreign invader. Histamine is a fiery flame, and fire can be great if you're trying to make food or to warm yourself, but fire out of control can wreak a lot of havoc. And so we need to be able to break down histamine. And internal to the body, especially intracellularly, we deal with histamine primarily with an enzyme pathway that requires methylation. And so we want to be thinking about histamine imbalance. Are people in your practice histamine dominant? And not just thinking about this sort of neck and above congestion, which is easy to spot, but where do people have chronic headache, insomnia, anxiety, irritable bowel, irritable bladder, right? Irritableness. Think about histamine. And where is this an indication that people are just struggling with the chronic overload of histamine? We need to be able to methylate well. That requires key nutrients, right? We have to check for sufficiency of those nutrients. Another major way in which we break down histamine is with an enzyme produced in the brush border lining of the intestines called diamine oxidase, or DAO. Well, like anything else in the body, no lettuce, no salad. You have to have the raw ingredients to make the biochemical substances that you're counting on. And an awful lot of enzymes in the body depend on vitamin B6. Well, if your patient is using oral estrogen-containing contraceptives, and they've been doing it for longer than a year, it's highly likely that their sufficiency of vitamin B6 is being threatened, which can affect hundreds of downstream disease dynamics. But you may not think about diamine oxidase being vitamin B6 dependent. It's also copper dependent. And in a global environment where people have been loading zinc supplements in the pandemic environment for a really long time, have people been taking copper zinc supplements? Have they been balancing all of that zinc supplement to boost their immune system with sufficient copper in their diet? I don't know, maybe, maybe not. Who is this person in front of you, right? We have to synthesize diamine oxidase, but then we also have to keep the brush border healthy. There's a lot of things we do that affect brush border enzyme synthesis, right? Or are people taking antibiotics? Are people using non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, right? Ibuprofen. Are they using steroid medications? Are they using products that contain artificial sweeteners or other chemical additives that can wreak oxidative wear and tear on the gut lining? This has an impact on our body's ability to synthesize optimal enzymes in the brush border. And if the pancreas, right? If the pancreas is perfectly healthy and it's putting out its complement of enzymes, but the brush border is struggling, then we're going to wrestle downstream not only with optimal nutrient absorption, but maldigested foods that are more likely to be antigenic. And yes, higher residual levels of histamine because we don't produce optimal levels of diamine oxidase. A real insidious impact on this also comes from anything you take in orally that has estrogen in it. Whether it's hormonal drugs, birth control pills, if they're estrogen containing, because the bolus of estrogen overtly suppresses the synthesis of DAO in the gut. Systemically, we know that higher estrogen states actually promote higher histamine levels. And if you're thinking about it from a defense and response perspective, and the fact that in preparation for pregnancy and birth, that higher estrogen would make a woman's immune system more hypervigilant to known threats. This makes a lot of sense, right? And there's so much progesterone flooded through a woman's body protecting the fetus, but we need to make sure that the environment is safe for pregnancy, for childbirth, from a survival of the species viewpoint. And so estrogen and progesterone have a bit of a dance trade-off relationship around histamine. So high estrogen states can struggle with histamine dominance. Women who are not ovulating consistently, so they're not making progesterone, which means they have an estrogen dominant dynamic, even if their estrogen levels are moderate, they're likely to struggle with histamine overload. So think about this in terms of their symptoms. Women with a PCOS type of dynamic, for example, or perimenopausal women, especially in this latter half of perimenopause, where we see progesterone slowly but surely trudge downward for years before estrogen begins to drop off in the average woman, especially women who are even slightly overweight, because body fat, adipose tissue makes estrogen. So we want to be looking for this estrogen progesterone imbalance, but estrogen in the gut, right? Whole hormones don't really belong in the gut. They wreak a lot of havoc there. And certainly they can be valuable triage, right? For short-term purposes. But especially with ongoing use, they are going to have effects that exacerbate disease dynamics. So be looking for histamine dynamics. The other thing I want to point out in particular is asking people what they're missing. Make sure your intake paperwork says, were you born with any body part that you are now missing or that is appreciably broken? Really powerful question. I can't tell you how many people I've served even in my practice alone, but we joke about it all the time in our SAFM practitioner forum. People who don't have a gallbladder and they've been led to believe that the gallbladder is so insignificant that it doesn't really matter. And they don't think to tell you they're missing a gallbladder. And this has a huge impact, not only with regard to the bolus collection of bile in the gallbladder that allows more intense episodic effects as opposed to the steady state drip, 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 drip that you get from your liver into the duodenum if you lack a gallbladder. That is not the same thing. It is not the same thing at all. And it brings home to us that the gallbladder and bile has many more effects beyond the emulsification and digestion of fats and fat-soluble vitamins. Bile is also antimicrobial, which is part of what helps keeps balance in the microbiome. Bile is a key agent of insulin signaling, which is a way in which hepatic biliary congestion contributes to metabolic disease, both as cause and effect. But I also want to highlight that there's also many unexpected ways in which a gallbladder can contribute to disease dynamics. And it has to do, for one example, is oxalates. Lots of foods contain oxalates, natural mineral binders in plant foods that help seeds, whatever foods are seeds in nature, whether it's a bean or a nut or a grain or a seed. Plant foods that are seeds, and then also some, dark leafy greens can have mineral binders in them because it's part of what helps protect the seed from sprouting when it's inappropriate. But oxalates bind with minerals, and then in foods and plants, and then we consume these foods, and the oxalates can, of course, bind with minerals in our gut. We have natural overrides in the human gut that is designed to protect us from those effects. We have species, oxalobacter and some other bacterial species in our natural, largely commensal microbiome that help to degrade oxalates. But one of the natural things that helps to prevent excessive systemic oxalate absorption into the human body is the fact that a gallbladder helps us to well digest and absorb fats. And that allows the oxalates to bind with some component of minerals in our diet and be escorted out of the body, right? But what happens if you're not well emulsifying and digesting and absorbing your fats? Then that actually leaves more of those fats in order to bind with minerals actually in the gut. It creates soaps in the gut so that more of those oxalates are likely to be absorbed systemically because they're not being bound and for excretion in the gut. And this is how we can end up with excessive oxalate loads internal to the body, which can increase the incidence of kidney stones. It doesn't overtly lead to them, but it predisposes people for sure. There's good, strong published evidence that, for example, a history of gallstones, gallbladder disease, and cholecystectomy increases the risk of kidney stones, and calcium oxalate stones are the most common variety. And now we could do an entire session here on the interconnectedness between the gallbladder and the kidneys. But this is a sort of stone-to-stone connection that you might not think about in terms of contributing extra oxalate burden to the kidneys for excretion if too excessive levels are being absorbed systemically because of imbalance in the gut. So something to think about, going across traditional silo boundaries and medical specialties and systems. Through the functional lens, everything is interconnected. And we learn to be keen, savvy detectives. And we learn not only how to spot some of the most common patterns, but we know how to look for the unexpected patterns. And so we want to be thinking about, increased risk of kidney stones downstream for cholecystectomy, which means we need to be looking upstream for hepatic biliary congestion and reversing it before there's gallbladder disease, or before there's gallstones, much less before there's gallbladder disease, much less before there's attacks and the need for emergency surgery. We can be looking for hepatic biliary congestion. We can be looking for subclinical or clinical elevations in alkaline phosphatase and bilirubin and gamma glutamyl transferase, right? ALT, AST. We can be looking, as I said before, for elevated LDL and then not settling for that, but questioning, where's this coming from, right? Hypothyroid, we're increasingly, actually some great studies have been published about this recently that I was alluding to last month. We're starting to understand more and more that hypothyroid function may precede an awful lot of fatty liver because of impaired beta oxidation of fats in the liver, which of course leads to that interstitial sequestering of fats in the liver. That's such a huge part of the cascade of metabolic disease. And so much rich interconnectedness. It's really fun. I'm going to end here talking about depression. I did an awesome video over the last weekend about anxiety through the functional lens. But mood imbalances, we still, unfortunately, even in integrative health, are still focused too much on the monoamine theories of anxiety and depression, right? You know, if you're depressed, it's because you have not enough serotonin. If you're anxious, it's because you have too much epinephrine. It's not that simple, my friends. Anxiety and depression are symptoms, and there are dozens of reasons why a person could viably be supported with a diagnosis of anxiety or a diagnosis of depression. But a mood response, right? That absolutely may involve not only neurotransmitters, but more importantly, neuropeptides. But looking upstream, what's causing that imbalance in those neurochemicals? What is promoting inflammation? I mean, I think we started to really well understand that inflammation and oxidative stress, both together or separately, promote mood imbalance. They can promote anxiety, they can promote depression. One versus the other may have a lot to do with the person's mindset. Are they the type of person where when their whole life system is confronted with a challenge that they feel unable to get out from under? Is their response one of more frustrated resignation and denial and hiding from and just feeling vulnerable and resigned to the circumstances? Or is their mindset promote more of a hypervigilant freak out? I've got to run, you know, I've got to, somehow I'm going to help it if I think about it all the time. The skewing, the balance of people's moods has a lot to do with their mindset. But I want to encourage you to think about various aspects of inflammation or oxidative stress in any mood imbalance. And in particular, from a nutrient viewpoint, when we're talking about depression, look at vitamin D levels, look at essential omega-3 fatty acid levels, look at the health of the microbiome. Is there an insufficient level of bifidobacteria? We know that the vagus nerve is highly affected by the various populations and their metabolites, their secretions in the microbiome. Huge connection between the gut and the brain. And when you modulate the microbiome, you change the behavior of the vagus nerve from both an afferent and an efferent perspective. From a gut talking to the brain perspective, right? We can be stimulating much more sympathetic nervous system response, higher levels of epinephrine, norepinephrine, glutamate, dominant dynamics where there's more glutamate, hyperstimulation, and less inhibitory GABA activity. And then from a downstream perspective, the brain talking to the gut, do we have good parasympathetic transmission that allows for resting, digesting, healing fertility, libido type of perspective? Or is there poor vagal tone as part of a sympathetic nervous system response that promotes hypervigilance and more downstream oxidative wear and tear from stress hormones? When in doubt, look at the nutrients, look at the gut. Depression is a common symptom, in particular, of hypothyroid function. Why wouldn't it be, right? Sluggish everything. Pain dynamics. People who struggle with all sorts of different pain syndromes, whether it is systemic, like a fibromyalgia, or chronic fatigue, or various types of myalgias, autoimmune myalgias, or more localized, things like arthritis, maybe not systemic, maybe only certain joints. There are a lot of contributing causes for that, but thinking about pain syndromes and where perhaps is low cortisol contributing to a pain syndrome, right? Where the body is purposefully creating a hypoadrenal state with lower cortisol levels, not because the adrenal gland is exhausted or busted or fatigued or any of that language, but because the HPA-TG axis is purposefully sending the adrenal gland down into a hypoadrenal state in order to allow healing, in order to allow full resolution of infectious dynamics, which high levels of cortisol directly inhibit. We want to be actually addressing the root causes. We need cortisol not only to orchestrate a stress response, but part of what cortisol does is keeps our stress response from damaging us. Cortisol is anti-inflammatory, right? That's why cortisol derivatives or a cortisone shot helps. Why it actually provides a benefit in terms of balancing cortisol response in a localized area. But we want to be thinking about what might be causing the buildup of immune complexes in a local tissue. Joints in particular are areas of low circulation, so they're more likely to trap immune complexes, which attracts, the immune complex buildup creates oxidative damage and wear and tear, which then attracts a secondary immune response in the local tissue. And this is where things like food allergies, food sensitivities, a high viral load, a dysbiosis dynamic in the gut, all of these can be an upstream major root cause of joint pain and arthritis. And if we don't look outside the joint, we're not going to find it. If we don't look across traditional silos of separation, we're not going to find it. But yeah, pain depresses people. Pain is depressing. And so we want to be looking at where can we get in front in some of those pain dynamics. Low serotonin is also a pain exacerbating dynamic. Serotonin is not just a calming or an inhibitory, I'm good, you're good, let's all have a party type of neurotransmitter. Serotonin is also key for mediating impulse control to avoid addiction. It is a key component of regulating appetite for people who are compulsive eaters. Serotonin is also key for pain perception, and people with low serotonin function can struggle with enhanced perception of pain. And again, key driver for depression, of course it is. And in these current pandemic times, we should be thinking about potentially low serotonin action, because in a pandemic environment, whether people actually are struggling with COVID disease, or if they picked up some other high viral load simply because of the chronic unremitting stress that so many are experiencing during this pandemic. When there's an ongoing infectious dynamic, the body will prioritize the utilization of tryptophan for supporting macrophage activity in order to counter an infection. And this leaves less tryptophan available for the synthesis of serotonin and also for the synthesis of melatonin. And this is because it's using tryptophan to support the kynurenine pathway, which is already the dominant pathway for tryptophan, by the way. Serotonin synthesis is not the dominant pathway. Very little of our tryptophan goes into serotonin synthesis. But even more of it is imbalanced during these infectious dynamics, and especially with high viral load. And so I already seeing it for sure, even in my practice. But people begin to struggle with suboptimal levels of tryptophan, and it's an essential amino acid. And especially if people are eating crap food during to self-medicate their stress, then they're going to have a lower intake of essential nutrients, including amino acids, the essential amino acids. And if there's not enough tryptophan, then we are going to struggle with optimal serotonin synthesis and neurotransmission. And so this is something to keep in mind. Vitamin B6, again, essential for serotonin synthesis, critical for a lot of neurochemical synthesis and metabolism. But we want to be thinking about sufficiency of serotonin and how that may be exacerbating some of the disease dynamics that people are wrestling with. But I hope you find some value from today. I could keep going and going, but I hope you take away a major message of there is a lot of overlooked early opportunity to see unexpected interconnectedness of disease promoting physiological and biochemical dynamics in the body. And as practitioners, we all need to be resiliently capable and very confident about doing this with a detective hat on, because otherwise I think we are not fulfilling the full potential of our impact in healthcare if we're waiting for disease dynamics to become severe enough before they're diagnosed. So I thank you all so much for being here. I wish you well with rising to your greatest potential in your calling as a healthcare practitioner.